Hello, I'm Robin Prater. I'm the Executive Director of the Lutyens Trust America. Welcome to this webinar, which is the 19th in our series. Today, we focus on the memorial to the missing of the Somme. According to the signed armistice, the end of the First World War hostilities were on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Remembrance Day in the UK and in many Commonwealth countries became a day to commemorate and honor members of the armed forces that died during that war and subsequent wars. The United States observes this day as Veterans Day, and both were observed last week. Edwin Lutyens' Memorial to the Missing of the Somme was designed to honor the thousands of men of the United Kingdom and South African forces who died fighting in the Somme and who have no known grave. Lutyens answered the call for such a memorial with a unique geometric composition that is a distillation of the classical tradition, a form that you recognize and then realize you've never seen before. As you watch the presentation, notice how the memorial looks and feels differently depending on your relationship to it. A solid pyramidal cubic mass when approached from the angle, a series of open arches from the front and sides, or an open, airy vault at the center of that focuses the eyes on the surrounding fields and sky. Our two speakers today are well suited to address the magnitude of this project. Jon Gedling is Director of Works at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Jon is a Chartered Building Surveyor and has worked in private practice and for various client-side organizations in the UK, specializing in the management of historic estates. His background has been particularly focused toward managing major conservation projects, and in previous roles, he was Assistant Property Manager for the Royal Household Property Section and Chief Surveyor at Eton College. Jon also acts as an assessor for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and is a member of the Historic England's Historic Estates Conservation Committee, which monitors the work of English heritage and the conservation and maintenance of the properties within the National Heritage Collection. Martin Lutyens is our esteemed chairman of the Lutyens Trust America and has served as the chairman of the Lutyens Trust for over 20 years. Martin was born in Kolkata, India, and was brought up and educated in England. After serving in the military, Martin embarked on a career with a major international consulting firm. In addition to his work with the Lutyens Trust, Martin has also served as the trustee of Glenbourne and as chairman of Sir John Soane's Museum Society. Today, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so they can be answered at the end of our presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. And thank you, Marcos Lutyens, for facilitating this webinar. If you're enjoying our webinars and are not already the member of the Lutyens Trust or the Lutyens Trust America, I ask that you please consider joining so that we can continue to provide ways for more people to get to know about Edwin Lutyens. And now I'll turn over to our panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin, and hello, everybody. First of all, just starting with a very quick introduction to who we are. My organisation was founded as the Imperial War Graves Commission back in the First World War, now known as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and we care for the graves and memorials of 1.7 million war dead, 23,000 locations around the world, 150 countries, and stretch from Archangel up in the Arctic Circle, the far north of Russia, down to the Falkland Islands, right down at the bottom. And the map on the screen now shows where we commemorate war dead around the world. So 150 countries altogether. We're funded by 6 member governments, so the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. We've got about 1,200 staff globally. We look after just over 2,000 constructed cemeteries and memorials globally, where we have responsibility for a building, structure, a memorial that features a vast range of types of sizes and building types. The largest cemetery we look after is Tyne-Cot in Belgium, here on the screen by Sir Herbert Baker. Absolutely vast cemetery, nearly 12,000 war dead. In addition, 35,000 names on a giant screen wall, Tyne-Cot Memorial, which is the curved wall at the top of the picture there, which I'll be returning to shortly. Those listening in the US might be interested to know that our smallest war cemetery is actually in North Carolina. So four naval casualties of the Second World War. So Tyne-Cot is enormous, but the next slide shows a small cemetery in France, which actually is far more typical. So this is Morlancourt Cemetery. It's a very simple cemetery. There's a cross, the cross of sacrifice there, which we'll come to shortly. There's a stone wall around the cemetery, and there's either a stone or a brick wall around nearly all of the cemeteries. Uniform headstones, carefully tendered headstone borders, and cut grass. And that's typical of cemeteries all across northern France and Belgium. In the First World War, 1 million of the British Empire were to die, more than half in France and Belgium. And by 1937, 937 war cemeteries had been built all along the line of the former Western Front, and 18 large memorials. And if anyone has ever been to the former battlefields of the Somme or of Flanders, you'll see hundreds of little cemeteries like this. And what's particularly poignant is if you're standing in one, you can often look around you and on the horizon see 5 or 6 other cemeteries. There are just lots and lots of cemeteries. So it's very, very moving. The largest memorial we care for, by far actually, is Thiepval. And there it is, dominates the Somme, dominates the landscape for miles and miles around. So 490 feet above sea level on a chalk plateau, 140 feet high, deliberately slightly shorter than the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Often described as Lutyens' greatest ever work. And during this webinar, Martin and I will talk a bit about the Lutyens, how he came to be involved, the construction of the memorial, how and why it was built. Just to say at this point, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, we care for around about 127 Lutyens cemeteries and memorials, where he was either the principal architect or had a close involvement in the design. Among the most well-known, aside from Thiepval, is Eton in northern France. There's near Boulogne, former casualty clearing station and major hospital in the First World War, and our largest war cemetery in France. Interestingly, the 2 pylons there with the stone flags, which Lutyens had hoped to include originally in the Cenotaph in London. So that was realised here at Eton. So the Tower Hill Mercantile Marine Memorial in London, opposite the Tower of London, where the names of those lost in the merchant navy are memorialised onto bronze plaques there. Back in France, Faubourg d'Amiens, it's only about 40 minutes from Thiepval, a large memorial in the Arras Flying Memorial as well by William Reed Dick. What's interesting here is that the memorial was actually unveiled the day before Thiepval. Originally, Lutyens had intended a tall, thin arch 124 feet high for this site, but had been forced to scale back his ideas. And the next slide shows Lutyens' last project. In fact, the last memorial to be built for the War Graves Commission, one of Lutyens' last ever work, which is Villers-Bretonneux, the Australian National Memorial. Barely finished before the Second World War began, and within 18 months was damaged by the German army moving through and occupying that area. I thought it might be interesting just a little bit of context of how the Imperial War Graves Commission came into being and why. This slide from 1922 shows the King's pilgrimage. So King George V is in front there with the beard, the present Queen's grandfather. That's him at Tyne-Cot. The gentleman behind him with the white moustache is Field Marshal Earl Haig, who was the commander of the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. I just wanted to pick up 2 individuals here. Firstly, just out of interest, the individual at the back with the red arrow, the gentleman turning away from the camera, is John Reginald Truelove, who was one of the architects for the War Graves Commission, and Lutyens actually nominated him to the commission and encouraged the commission to employ Truelove, who went on to work for the commission for a long time and was involved in the design of many cemeteries and memorials, and worked with all the principal architects, including Lutyens at Belgian Battery Corner near Ypres in Belgium. But really the individual I wanted to focus on is the man in the front with the blue arrow highlighting who he is with the papers in his hand, and that is Sir Fabian Ware, who was our founder. And he was an interesting character. He was formerly a newspaper editor. When First World War broke out, he was too old to fight, but he went and served with the Red Cross in France and was responsible for transporting casualties of the battlefield. And Ware became distressed at seeing that fallen soldiers were being buried by their comrades quickly, hastily beside the road or just on the battlefield. The location marked with temporary wooden crosses, often just names marked in pencil, and records were quickly becoming lost. So Ware became distressed at this, set up a process for recording war dead and the locations, and eventually persuaded the British Army to support him, and a graves registration unit was set up with Ware as the lead, and their task became huge as the First World War progressed. Eventually, 1917, King George V granted the Imperial War Graves Commission a royal charter, and that royal charter still in place today, and we're considered a royal charter body to this day. There's a couple of things were quite new at the time. One aspect was unusual was individually recording all of the dead separately. That hadn't really happened on scale until the First World War, but it was one of the very early principles of the War Graves Commission. The other aspect was that there was to be no repatriation of the dead for the British war dead, which caused an absolute outcry. But the British Army insisted on that all throughout the First World War, that none of the dead were to be repatriated back to Britain. The two reasons for that, really, one was the practical one, the sheer scale of death, and exhuming and returning bodies 100 years ago would have been incredibly challenging. But also a sort of philosophical point that Ware and the War Graves Commission wanted a concept of military cemeteries of the dead, fallen comrades lying together, equality in death was the concept, and that was rigidly adhered to in the face of a great deal of controversy back home in the UK. It was always the intention that lots of smaller cemeteries would be created, but that there would be huge attention paid to the design and the quality of their architectural and horticultural treatment. And to achieve this, Ware turned to three prominent architects of the Empire at the very height of their careers, and they were Sir Edwin Lutyens, Sir Herbert Baker, and Sir Reginald Blomfield. And during summer 1917, he invited them to join him in France. First World War was still in progress, took them over to France and asked for their advice about how the war cemeteries should be designed. It may come as perhaps no surprise, they really could not agree. And they all came back to Britain and still couldn't agree, writing lots of letters to Ware with their ideas. And Ware couldn't determine how to move ahead with so many different opinions. So he had the master stroke of approaching the gentleman on the left of the screen there, Sir Frederick Kenyon, director of the British Museum, who had the sort of intellect and the tact and the credibility to pull together an expert committee, bring together all of the ideas and write a major report in 1918, the Kenyon report, about how the war cemeteries should be designed. The Kenyon report went on to establish principles that were used all throughout the First World War, throughout the Second World War as well, and are still used guiding our work to this day. The key principle was that really they were aimed for equality. The memorials should be permanent. There should be no distinction made on the basis of rank or class, whether military or civilian. And actually, this was quite revolutionary for 100 years ago. That's what they aimed to achieve. In Europe, they pretty much did. Regrettably, outside of Europe, that was not always achieved. And a major project we're working on now is to try to right some of those wrongs where there was inconsistency around the world. In terms of design of the cemeteries, there were simple guidelines really for the architects, and an awful lot of freedom was given to them. But there were certain repeating symbols, and these two features in particular that were included in the design. And at this point, I'm going to hand across to Martin to just talk a little bit more about the symbolism of these features.
Thank you very much, John. Well, shortly before the First World War broke out, Lutyens had been commissioned along with Herbert Baker to design New Delhi in India. And he, as John said, was at the peak of his career. He was therefore, this made him a sort of natural choice to be an advisor to the Imperial War Graves Commission on the principles. And there was quite a debate about what the symbolism should be. Herbert Baker was very keen that the cemeteries should follow the idea of country graveyards in England. Lutyens was looking for something more abstract, if I could put it like that. He was very impressed by his first visit in 1917 to the battlefields, and he wrote to his wife afterwards, and this is a quote from his letter: "A ribbon of isolated graves, like a Milky Way, across miles of country, where men were tucked in where they fell. Ribbons of little crosses, each touching across a cemetery, set in a wilderness of annuals, mainly poppies they were, and where one sort of flower is grown, the effect is charming, easy, and so pathetic. One thinks that for the moment, that no other monument is needed." Well, the reason that another monument was needed was obviously the memorialization had to be on a perpetual basis. What you're looking at now is the result of Lutyens' thinking. He wrote to Surveyors saying, after that trip, saying what we need is one fine stone, 12 feet in length, bearing a simple inscription, and on 3 steps, as you see in this photograph here. To cut a long story short, this idea was adopted. And the only other thing I'd like to say about this particular feature is that it is in most of, in fact, I think I'm right in saying, John, all of the large cemeteries and a lot of the smaller ones as well. So it's a feature that runs in a common way right through the cemetery construction. And if you think it's simply a simple block of stone, like many other parts of Lutyens' work, it looks simple, but it isn't. And I'm advised by others who know a lot more than I do about this, that it is actually composed of fragments of 2 imaginary spheres with a diameter of 1,801 feet, 18 inches. And one is above ground and one is below ground. And if you take sections out of those spheres, they will give you what appear to be horizontals and verticals of this stone. And together, using that rather complicated geometry, gives you the effect that you see now. And if the wood lines of the verticals and the horizontals were actually straight and rectangular, you would not see what you see in front of you now. This is the principle of entasis, or optical correction, used since the times of the Greeks in architecture. Can I have the next slide? Can I have the next slide? Right, John, can I hand you back to?
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, Memorials to the missing, it was also established quite early by the War Graves Commission that those who had fallen on the battlefield and the bodies were not recovered should also be memorialised and individually named. And there was an original thought about whether to have empty graves, so whether there'd be a headstone for everyone, including where there was no body. And that was ruled out on practicality grounds. And instead, memorials to the missing were intended. And there were, to give an idea of scale, 315,000 missing in France and Belgium alone, where bodies could not be recovered. By a cut-off date, which was 1921, we decided that those not recovered by that date would be considered missing. So 12 memorials were intended. In fact, that needed to be scaled back. There began to be opposition in Belgium and in France to the number of memorials that were being constructed by foreign governments, and the ideas were scaled back. So it was reduced to 4 in France and 2 in Belgium. And here is Sir Reginald Bloomfield's 1927, the Menin Gate, 54,500 war dead, but it wasn't big enough. So Baker added the Tyne-Cot Memorial, which we saw on the slide earlier. Huge numbers of commemorations there. 4 memorials in France, which were Soissons, La Ferté-Chouzoir, and Baker's Memorial at Neuve-Chapelle, which left finally the large battlefield memorial of the Somme. Which brings us to Thiepval, really. Before the war, it was a flourishing, peaceful, rural village, 4 miles north of Albert in northern France. It contained about 60 houses, about 200 people lived there, 17th century chateau. It was a very quiet, rural spot where people came to fish. 1916, it found itself at the epicenter of one of the most notorious battles of the First World War, the Somme. It's the greatest ever loss of life of the British Army, and the first day of the Battle of Somme is considered by historians to be one of the bloodiest days in all of human history. I'm no battlefield historian, but it's worth just touching on what happened here. So 1st of July 1916, supported by a French attack to the south, so 13 divisions of Empire forces launched a major offensive uphill against heavily fortified German positions and German lines. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, 19,000 dead on the British side in just that one day. Despite a preliminary bombardment lasting a week, German defences were barely touched and the attack met unexpectedly fierce resistance. The losses were absolutely catastrophic, and the wounded lay on the battlefield sometimes for days. And there's a major battle for every village, every farmhouse, every copse. At the end of September, the village of Thiepval was finally captured, and that had been one of the original objectives back in July. In fact, over the Battle of the Somme, barely about 5 or 6 miles of land was gained, much to be lost again later on in the war. By the end, the Battle of the Somme ended in November. There were 420,000 dead of the British Empire, slightly more than that on the German side. Absolutely shocking loss of life. And you see this, this very evocative photograph from the archives of the Imperial War Museum. Shows Thiepval in 1916, an utterly destroyed landscape. The village was obliterated. There's just a pile of stones stood where the chateau had once been. All the trees had been destroyed for miles around, vast craters. This was an absolutely destroyed landscape. And into this horrendous landscape comes Sir Edwin Lutyens, asked to design the memorial for the missing. And this great sketch taken from the RIBA collection. I'm going to hand back across to Martin and just talk a little bit about this sketch and Lutyens' early ideas.
Right. Well, the sketch has a very personal interest for me, as a matter of fact, because it's on his 17 Queen Anne's Gate writing paper, which many years later was my own office. I didn't know it at the time, so just a small coincidence. So this is a way that he often conveyed his ideas to his clients, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was, in a sense, a client. He would draw out his ideas with lightning sketches. He was a brilliant draftsman. He had taught himself to draw, taught himself perspective, and this is an example of his work. As a matter of fact, this design was originally proposed for a memorial at Saint-Quentin, further south along the line. It was originally to span a road, and that project did not go ahead, and he adapted it and amended it to what you see here. And you can see at the entrance at the front, there are steps going up into it, which shows you that it's definitely the Thiepval one and not the Saint-Quentin one. And to give you an idea of scale, you will see it in the lower left-hand foreground. There's a little tiny figure, and that really sort of sums up the scale of this extraordinary and enormous memorial. It was completed not exactly as in this sketch, because of course there's no dome in the completed memorial. But this gives you an idea of how he worked, how he got his ideas across, and where the origin of the Thiepval Memorial came from. Next slide, please. Can I? John, I think you better talk about the construction.
We've got a whole series of photographs of the construction of Thiepval, and just sort of picking up from Martin's comments. Yeah, Lutyens is forced to use the alternative site. Final permission is given to build a memorial in April 1929, which followed 2 years of quite protracted discussions with the French authorities. But in the end, this site was chosen within the former grounds of the chateau. And work started immediately and continued until 1932. Some great images of the construction. Concrete was used, Massangy stone, local French stone, Portland stone for the panels of the names, and brick. A local brick was used, which proved to be a disastrous choice, unfortunately, which I'll return to later. And the point of interest, during construction, 3 German dugouts were uncovered 24 feet deep, still full of the boxes of shells. Next slide, this slide shows the opening ceremony. So there's Lutyens there in the background. 1st of August 1932, so unveiled by Prince of Wales, President of France. Lutyens was to say he was glad that the opening ceremony was kept short, and the journalists were hanging around the Prince of Wales like flies, the comments he made after the ceremony. And here's a modern day shot of the memorial. Just to say on the sort of bottom left hand side there, those steps going down were added, subsequently added by Sir Ralph Hobday, and they lead down to a cemetery which we come on to shortly. So this is it finished, the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing. Bears the name more than 72,000 in the United Kingdom and South African forces who died on the Somme before 20th March 1918, and about 90% of those commemorated died between the July and the November of 1916. Those of other nationalities, by the way, are commemorated elsewhere on other memorials. So this is just the British South African forces. Very interesting design with all the arches. So it's a particular feature of the construction. And I'll hand back to Martin just to talk a little bit more about that.
Right, well, looking at this aerial photograph, you can see on the left-hand side, you have what is in effect a larger triumphal arch with a large central arch flanked by 2 smaller ones. If you look at the right-hand elevation, which is lit in the sun there, you can see that it's the same concept, but smaller, and it penetrates through the first of the 2 arches. You may wonder where this idea came from. Well, Lutyens was confronted with the idea of having to provide wall space for over 70,000 names. And it's not easy. You couldn't write 70,000 names, for instance, on the memorial in front of you. This is the India Gate on which he had been working a little while before in Delhi. And I'd like just to point out a couple of things about it. First of all, and if you look at it casually, it does look like it has similarities with the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, but with a sort of pared back and rather abstract superstructure. Two things about it I'd like to show you is if you look at the smaller arch and you look at its keystone at the top, and you then follow the keystone round to the larger arch, that forms the springing point for the larger arch. So this is the way that those two arches are connected. And we shall see how that principle works when we get back to Thiepval in a moment. The other thing that's perhaps worth mentioning is the carving on the front of the piers of this memorial are in fact an abstract version of the end elevations of the cenotaph in London, which we referred to before. So here you have Lutyens incorporating in abstract form in this memorial what he'd been doing in London some years before. There it is. What he's done in Delhi is to take the wreath that is on the side elevation of the cenotaph and place it above what the carving on the India Gate Memorial. So can I have the next slide, please? So there you are. You've got a quick glimpse of the abstract cenotaph again on that memorial there. So here we are back at Thiepval itself. This is, to me, a very atmospheric photograph. And what I'd like to point out, can you help me with this, please, Robin, is the linkage between the smallest and the largest arches. Can you, right. Now, there on the string course, you can see running in red from the smallest arch to the springing point of the next largest one. Round you go to the keystone of the next largest arch and come back again, you zigzag back, and there you are at the springing point of the next larger arch. And lo and behold, if you follow the string course above that, back from the keystone of the third arch, it takes you back to the biggest one. And it's in this way that Lutyens tied together and stacked up these arches of successively increasing size. Now, why would he want to do this? The answer is that he needed a very large amount of wall space for carving the names of this over 70,000 missing at the Battle of the Somme. And can we look inside? Can we have the next slide, please? The effect of these intersecting arches is to give you 16 separate plinths, 4, 4, 4, 4, and consequently, all of that wall space is enough for you to. It was enough for the authorities in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to accommodate all of the names of the missing on those columns. If it had simply been 4 plinths with no interpenetrating passages going through them, the wall space would obviously have been much smaller. So can we have a look inside one of the tunnels, please, Robin? And this is what it is like if you're on the ground and looking through one of the arcades formed by the succession of arches. And on the left and right, in the immediate foreground, you can see the close packed names of some of the missing. And on all, if not, I think it's all, maybe a majority of the interior walls likewise covered in these names. You may ask what happens in the course of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's work, unearthing and disinterring bodies which are found in the surrounding countryside. Well, John can explain to you what they do, but they very carefully remove the names from this memorial because they're no longer missing, and replace them with fresh panels which have had the names of the recovered bodies removed. I'd also like just to point out, in the vaulting of these arches, there is a strange kind of coffering, and I'd like to show you another slide, please. Oh, yes, and to get a clearer picture, inside the large arch, you could just catch a glimpse of it there as well. Now, where did Lutyens get this inspiration from? And the answer is that he'd already been studying what to do when he was building the Viceroy's house, now Rashtrapati Bhavan, in Delhi. And there, round the dome of the Viceroy's house, is the same carved stone railings, which instead of being convex as they are in this photograph you're looking at, he has turned them concave and put them inside the main arch of Thiepval. Can I have the next slide, please?
And these are inspired by the Great Stupa, right?
Sorry?
These were inspired by his study of the Great Stupa.
They were the dome and railings were both inspired by Lutyens' study of Indian architecture before he started on New Delhi, and in particular by the Great Stupa at Sanchi. At Thiepval, he has taken those railings, which are convex here, and turned them inside out to vault the arches. And there you have a fine photograph by my cousin Candia Lutyens showing you what the result is. Okay. All right, Robin. I referred before to the way that Lutyens took features from one place and used them or reused them elsewhere. And this photograph is of the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Christ the King that Lutyens was asked to design quite a few years later in Liverpool, England. And I just ask you to look at the entrance, which is to the right of the photograph. And there you can see a combination of arches. In fact, the proportions of these ones are slightly different. They're slightly more elongated, but it's clearly the same concept as the Thiepval Memorial. And those triple arches with intersecting smaller arches goes right through this cathedral, which sadly was never built. And it was described by his son, Robert, who was also an architect, as the greatest building never built. So that's fine. Thank you. And now this, before I hand back to John, this isn't the crypt of the Roman Catholic Cathedral. In fact, the only part of the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool which was built was the crypt, and it is still there and capable of being visited. It's well worth it. But this isn't the crypt of the cathedral, it's the crypt of the Thiepval Memorial. So I'd like to hand back to John, please.
And the basement under the entirety of Thiepval Memorial is cathedral-like. It's absolutely vast and beautiful in its own right, actually. So we'll just include a photograph just to give some sense of that. The next slide just shows the memorial from a different view with the cross of sacrifice on the left-hand side there. The memorial also stands as an Anglo-French battle memorial in recognition of the joint sacrifice in the 1916 offensive. And there's a small cemetery there, equal number of Commonwealth and French war dead lying at the foot of the memorial. Also, just of interest, Thiepval was captured during the Second World War and occupied by the German army. The memorial was used as a lookout post, and there is still some graffiti right at the top on the door that leads you out on the top of the memorial. with some of the graffiti left by the soldiers at the time of the Second World War. Just spend a few moments talking about an ongoing restoration project of the memorial. So to coincide with the centenary of the First World War, we undertook a major first phase of the restoration of the Thiepval Memorial, concentrating on all of the top section. And those who may remember, there was a big candlelit vigil which formed the centrepiece of the First World War commemorations, attended by the President of France, Prince of Wales, Prince William and Harry. That was under the centre arch at Thiepval. We've gone back and earlier this year began the second phase, finishing, carrying on where we left off. So concentrating on all the lower sections with brick and stone repairs, repointing, but also quite a lot of work to the Portland stone panels carrying the names of the missing. And this shows some of the panels, the font by Jon Gedling, designed for the Imperial War Graves Commission. But Martin referred to this earlier, that it's never, the number of names on the memorial has never been static. There's a continual process of amendments and additions. And that's because historians or descendants of those who died may come to us and say that they have spotted an error, which might be in a name or an initial or other aspects where the commemoration is wrong. And if they can prove it and we accept the proof, we will make the change. So we will never say, well, it's a long time ago, so it stays as it is. We will make the change. There's a major addenda panel on the memorial added a few years ago on the sort of Hob Day section. But constant process of change, and that forms part of the current project. Sometimes, though, it's not just names to be added. We have the opposite scenario. And on the next slide, we see this from the Guardian newspaper in the UK. Very unusual situation where a casualty was recovered from the battlefield and could be clearly positively identified. So this was just 2013. Widening of the road leading to Thiepval, and French contractors found the body of Sergeant Blakey, who served the British Army, and he was reburied with military honours in another of our nearby cemetery. The reason I'm mentioning this is because his name was on Thiepval, and his name needed to come off Thiepval because, as Martin said earlier, he was no longer missing. So it's a process for how this is done. What you can't do is just leave a gap, because that would look terrible. But neither can you shuffle up 72,000 names. So common sense needs to apply, and the principles of keeping the sort of dignity and also the ordering on the memorial. So just some photos here of how this is done in practice. The top left there shows our drawing office here in the UK, where every panel is it's included in our computer-aided design package, and all the names set out to the millimetre. So where a panel needs to be replaced, it's redrawn, electronic file sent to our headstone production unit in France, and the machine on the top right there in Seisograph, engraving the name. The McDonald font is still used, it's all been digitised. The bottom left shows some of the completed panels. And the bottom right, this was taken a few weeks ago, and shows one of the panels being installed. So there's around about 60 panels altogether being replaced. Some of those where they have become badly deteriorated by water ingress passing through the memorial and become illegible, and some where there were so many changes required to the names that it made sense to replace the whole panel. As part of the memorial, we're undertaking a number of other repairs as well. I alluded earlier to issues with the brick, and I think this is an absolutely wonderful memorial and a fantastic design, but there were errors, and the biggest error was in the selection of the brick. So 1929, when the memorial was under construction, Lutyens' assistant was raising concerns about the brick choice. And unfortunately, it proved to be unresistant to the elements. Really, the memorial was open to all four sides on a hillside, and the bricks just didn't last. 1947, just 15 years after it was opened, there's a recommendation to renew all the brickwork, and that was done in the mid-1950s. So the memorial was virtually completely refaced. Unfortunately, the 1950s selection of brickwork was also not correct, and it was refaced almost entirely for a second time in 1971. And an Accrington brick from England was used, which is the brickwork we see today. And a system was designed to create a cavity behind the bricks, and they chopped out 2.5 inches of the core and hung bricks from sort of wall ties, which was quite ingenious. It partly worked, but there's been an ongoing issue where water gets in behind the brick, runs down, right down behind, and ends up on top of the panels of the names of the missing. And there's sort of anecdotally, in the past, panels have been removed and water has poured out. There's that much water in the structure. So part of the project now is to try to make sure that water is shed away from the building, and also to install more wall ties as well. So the system's been devised to do that. But also, you know, brick, not many brick replacements, but certainly repairs, repointing, some stone repairs as well. We have been very generously supported in this work by the French state. Between the first phase of work and the second, the memorial was listed, and that enabled us to apply for grant aiding. So the French government, the local commune, have given us substantial amounts of money, in total around €1 million, but not just financial support. They've also been incredibly helpful to us as the design has progressed and we required permissions and consents to do the work. So the project's on site right now. It's due to finish around July of next year. And on the next slides, just showing you some of the work in progress. So that's one of my colleagues, one of our French stonemasons, who's been making the minor corrections. This has been ongoing. He's been there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And we've still got another, I think 30 have been added since he thought he'd finished. So the names just, the amendments keep on coming. So just a continual process. I think on the next slide, just sort of interesting views, the main arch looking out towards the cemetery beyond. So we have a Belgian contractor working on the project of the Monument Group, and the Belgian architect, the same architect who was involved in phase 1. So a great team working on site. And as I say, the work finishes in the middle of next year. I should say over the winter, work moves to that large undercroft, where there will be a series of repairs to try to control water ingress through the floor into the basement, and also to address some of the issues with a very complicated system of internal downpipes that Lutyens designed. So my final slide, just a lovely photo again taken by candidate Lutyens of Thiepval at dawn. Just my final comments really, we had a tour of Lutyens Trust members a few years ago to Lutyens cemeteries and memorials in France, including Thiepval. And we were at the early stages of thinking of doing that for Lutyens Trust America before COVID came along, but we'd be absolutely delighted to host a trip when travel becomes easier again. It'd be great to be able to show those who are interested and able to come into the memorial, into that giant undercroft and up onto the roof as well. And let's see a few more of the Lutyens cemeteries and memorials nearby. So that's all from me. I'm just going to hand back across to Martin for some final remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And I'd just like to say a very big thank you to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for all that it does to maintain these memorials and others all over the world. If the architects are up there kind of looking down, or down there looking up from where they are today, I'm sure that they would be proud and grateful as well. So from the point of view of the Lutyens Trust, it's completely wonderful to have your organization, John, taking care of this great Lutyens heritage in all the places where it is. Thank you very much indeed. And now, if you have any questions, please put them on the Q&A. I can see there are some there already, and Marcus Lutyens will read them out, and John will do his best to answer them.
So we have a question from Laura Reynolds. Do you know how Lutyens did not include, do you know why Lutyens didn't include the dome from his original sketch in the final design?
So my understanding was that he was asked by the Imperial War Graves Commission to cut the memorial down by 25%, and that was, I think, partly on the grounds of cost, but also Fabian Ware was very sensitive to French concerns about the number of memorials being built. Remember, this was quite some time after the First World War had ended, and he was also mindful that, as originally designed, it would have been taller than the Arc de Triomphe. So it was made very slightly smaller, very slightly lower. But then I did hear that the flagpoles, once you get to the top of the flagpoles, it then it's back taller again. But that was why, essentially.
There's a question from Peter Foland. I recently saw a very impressive scale model of Thiepval Memorial at Castle Drogo. Were models used in many of the memorials during the design stage, and do you know of any others still in existence?
I'm not aware of any. Yeah, I don't know that they do. I mean, we've still got all the original archive plans for most of the memorials, but I've not seen any other models. I'm not aware one's created for any other than you are, Martin.
I'm not aware. The model in question, I think I'm right in saying, was made for the Hayward Gallery Lutyens exhibition in the early 1980s. And it was taken to Castle Drogo along with a number of other models of Lutyens' work as a place of safekeeping. And they're all still there as far as I know. But I'm not aware of any other models on the same sort of scale of other Lutyens memorials now.
We have a question from John Titman. The original design without west steps, you mentioned added later down to the field of the cemetery, seems to me more powerful than the resulting design with the steps. Originally, a visitor cannot cross to the dead, emphasizing the loss. Can you comment on your thoughts to what EL may have been thinking?
I just say I would agree. I think that the steps really add to the memorial. Yeah, I don't know what Lutyens' original intention was. I know the idea of adding the cemetery was Fabian Ware's, who had the thought of an Anglo-French tribute, and that was realised in the form of the cemetery next to the memorial. So the Hobday steps, I think, really added to it. There were other changes that were perhaps more regrettable. So Lutyens on the other side of the memorial designed long sort of forecourt walls that ended in a semicircle and looked absolutely beautiful. They were lowered and parts removed, and that was Sir Edwin Morphy, who was the principal architect for the commission, and that change was made that's perhaps a bit more regrettable. But yeah, I think the Hobday steps really add to the design.
John, I think you or one of your colleagues told me that there was a move afoot to reinstate. Is that a pipe dream, or could it happen?
Well, we've talked about it for a number of years, and it would be great to do that, whether in the form of walls, whether it's in the form of a clipped hedge. There's various ideas being explored. We're also looking about what we could do to the wider landscapes. The trees surrounding the memorial have grown very large, and there's a very dense tree belt, and some of the views have begun to be lost. So we're talking to the French authorities now about a further phase of thinning and removing some of the trees to try to realise Lutyens' original design intentions of the views.
We have a question from Nigel Hammett. What happens in the various levels? Are there rooms? And what is the orientation of the memorial?
Yeah, so yes, there are rooms. So you go up a series of steps, and we took the tour group up the top of the memorial 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah, so there's certainly above the big arch, there's a very large space. Nothing in it actually, beautiful space, which stands completely empty, and then a spiral staircase takes you right to the top, and the door then leads you out to just the foot of those flagpoles. And the flagpoles actually were installed in the last phase of the restoration with a lowering system as well. So that's how we get the flags down. The architectural lighting was also added in the previous phase and is remote controlled as well, so is used for events and functions. But yes, there are a series of chambers as you go up. Also, from within the undercroft, there's a network of staircases within the piers. It's a very sort of complex system of accessing all the different parts of the memorial.
And anybody who wants to see inside those, if John is kind enough to allow it, I think if you ask him nicely, he probably will allow it. He certainly allowed the Lutyens Trust to have 2 visits right up inside and down into the undercroft of the memorial, and it's a really fascinating experience. And when you get to the top, of course, you look out over the terrible battlefield where the events memorialized here took place.
Yeah, and it's certainly very poignant standing at the top, because you can actually identify the lines of the trenches still, and you can see across. You can see for miles. You can see a number of cemeteries on the horizon. The Ulster Memorial nearby is very special. You know, to go up to the top, and yeah, it'd be great to be able to take a group across and to go up there and show everybody.
So another good reason to join the Lutyens Trust. Or the Lutyens Trust America, even better, right?
Both.
Maybe we have time for one last question from Tim Hinkle. Do you have any insight as to why water intrusion at the masonry has been so challenging? Great Britain has centuries of successful experience with masonry wall construction.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that there were problems right from the beginning, and in fact, apparently one of the journalists at the opening ceremony mentioned the fact that the brickwork was saturated. Lutyens, he didn't design any form of cavity behind the brickwork. He was using the standards of construction of the day. I don't know whether the exposure of the memorial wasn't fully appreciated. But yeah, there were endless problems, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure. I think the work in the 50s clearly was sort of well intentioned, and an awful lot of work had gone into that. We've got files and files of documents about this idea of introducing a cavity. But I think that there was a whole series of other problems. You know, there's 21 flat roofs, and each one sort of drains in this complex system. And shedding water away from this building, I think it was a challenge right from the start.
Right.
So I think that's all we've got time for in terms of questions. Robin or Martin, would you like to wrap it up?
Just thank you all for attending our webinar and listening and supporting us. And thank you so much to Jon and to Martin for your excellent presentation. We really appreciate it. Hope you all have a good week.